Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, and every week we bring you the stories of people who are improving the lives of others locally, globally, digitally, all over the world. It's exciting to be able to share these kinds of stories of innovative service. It is a special joy that we have in the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, one of 36,000 Rotary clubs around the world, with approximately 1.2 something million members, all of whom are dedicated to this idea of service above self. For us, one of the ways we do that service is to serve our speakers. We want their stories to have different avenues for their message. We want that to be a part of our YouTube channel, our podcast channels. We want to extend the conversation about how we can all do service yet better, right? So along those lines, we have the opportunity today to talk with Dr. Mark Rank. Mark is in St. Louis, Missouri. He is a researcher on poverty, and I read an article at some point fairly recently about the poverty calculator, which I'm very excited for him to explain to us. If you want to read the full bio, you can certainly do so. The easy way to do it would be to pause the video or podcast that you're on, take a good look at that page where you found this, and then read about the many cool things that Mark has done. With that said, what I'd like to do is hand it over to Mark. Mark, welcome to the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley.
Oh, thanks, Rushton. It's great to be with you, and I'm really pleased to get a chance to talk to folks in the Rotary clubs around the country and around the world, which is terrific. Um, as you said, a lot of my research over the years has focused on the topics of poverty and inequality, and particularly looking at those issues within the context of the United States, although I've done a bit of work outside of that, but largely focusing on the United States. And one of the things that I've encountered during this time is that there are a lot of misperceptions and stereotypes surrounding these topics in terms of the wider public at large. And we could spend, an hour talking about what those are. Just to name a few, one idea that people often think about is that, oh, people are in poverty for long periods of time. Well, it turns out that actually most people who experience poverty are there for fairly short periods of time, although that may reoccur down the road. Another kind of myth or stereotype is most people in poverty live in urban inner cities. Well, there certainly is poverty in urban inner cities, but it turns out poverty rates are actually higher in rural America. And there's actually more people in poverty in suburban regions than there are in central city areas. Um, Another kind of myth is that, well, people are in poverty because they're just not working hard enough. This is this idea of, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and this kind of thing. And a lot of my work is focused on understanding poverty from a more structural point of view. That is, the economy is not providing enough decent paying jobs for everybody who needs that. Our social policies are very weak in terms of helping people out of poverty. So my argument is that poverty is much more of a structural kind of issue than an individual kind of failure. And then another myth, a final myth that I'll just mention, is that this idea that the welfare state or the social safety net that we have in the United States is very generous for people who need it. And it turns out actually our social safety net is very weak compared to a number of other sort of industrialized countries. So these are just a few of the myths and perceptions that I've encountered along the way surrounding the issue of American poverty. But there's another misperception that's quite prevalent and one that I've really focused a lot of my research on. And that is that poverty only really strikes a small percentage of the population. And poverty is something that happens to someone else and not to me. That the issue of poverty is really an issue of them rather than an issue of us. And so as a result of that, I started thinking about, well, what's the likelihood that an American at some point in their life will experience poverty? Was it just a small percentage or was it much larger? It turns out we really knew very little about that question. We have a lot of information about how many folks are poor in a given year or for a few years, but there was no work on the long-term risk of poverty. Now, in order to answer that question, what you need is long-term longitudinal data. So in other words, you have to follow the same people or the same families over time to see what happens economically to them. Well, it turns out there is such a data set, and it's a really valuable one. And I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty of it, but it's called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. It started in 1968. It's a national survey of American households, and it's been following the same households, or when people drop out, replacing them for the last 50 years. And what it's really focused on are demographic and economic issues. And so we can look each year at what happens to these households over time. And that's the approach that I've taken. It's kind of putting that data together and looking at, well, what is the long-term risk of poverty? It turns out that that risk actually is quite high. So depending on how you want to measure poverty, the estimate is that between the ages of 20 and 75, between 60 and 75% of Americans at some point will experience a year of poverty. So the vast majority of Americans at some point will experience poverty. If we look at children, for example, we found that 50% of all American children will be in a household that uses the SNAP or food stamp program at some point during their childhood, which is another marker of poverty. And people often say to me, well, how can these percentages be so high? But think about this. When you look over a long period of time, it's more likely that events and bad luck and bad things can happen to people. Things like losing a job or getting sick or a pandemic happening. When those things happen, there's a pretty good likelihood that people might be thrown into poverty. And so the idea is that the longer you look at something, the more likely a risk may occur, such as an economic risk. And that also, the interesting thing about that is that turns this question on its head of poverty being an issue of them versus poverty being an issue of us. Because what we found is that at some point, again, the majority of Americans will experience poverty. So it's an issue that affects many, many people. Now, one of the things that I was interested in is, okay, in academia, we publish papers and things like that, and like a dozen people read these, these studies. But how could you make this more accessible and widespread to the wider population? And so I thought, why not construct a website that has a lot of information about poverty and inequality, but why not construct a calculator that allows people to use this research and put in their characteristics or someone else, and then look at what's the 5, 10, or 15-year risk of poverty of me running into that. So this took a lot of computing and programming and all that stuff, but we were able to do it. And I should say the poverty risk calculator is very analogous to the heart disease risk calculators that you see on the internet all over the place. So you say, okay, what's my age? What are my cholesterol numbers? This kind of thing. And you get a 10-year risk of having a heart attack. Well, this is the same idea. This is the 10-year risk of experiencing poverty based on 5 demographic characteristics. So this is the overall website. It's called Confronting Poverty. And it has a lot of different things in it, but kind of the main tool here is this risk calculator. So let's click on this. So what it does is it asks, there's 3 steps here in terms of looking at a particular risk of poverty. And it says, first of all, select the time period that you want to look at. Do you want to predict your future risk of poverty in the next 5, 10, or 15 years? So let's just say we want to look at the next 15 years. And then we hit next, and it says, now what level of poverty do you want to look at? So this is based on the official poverty line in the United States. So near poverty is falling below half of the official poverty line. And I should say, this past year for a family of 3, the poverty line was around $25,000. So if you were in a family of 3, this would be about $12,000 or $13,000 that you earned over the course of the year, which would be extreme poverty. One can look at the official poverty rate, or one could look at near poverty, which would be 150% of the poverty line. So let's just say we want to look at the official poverty line here in terms of our risk of poverty. So we hit that. And again, there's some information here about that as you go along. And then we hit next. And now it's asking for 5 characteristics to then estimate what the risk of poverty will be. So let's just put white, let's say high school or less, female, not married, and let's take somebody who's 25 to 29. So we select those characteristics and we're now going to hit submit. And the calculator now says that for somebody who's 25 to 29, white, high school or less, female, not married, their risk of poverty in the next 15 years is 45.3%. Now, what's really cool is you can on the fly say, well, let me just change this to the risk in 10 years. If you do that, it's 41.2%, or the risk in 5 years, it's 36.4%, because obviously, as you look at shorter periods of time, the risk of poverty is going to be lower. You can also then on the fly change this. So instead of poverty, let's say we want to look at extreme poverty in the next 5 years. We click that. Well, it's much less, 16.5%. If we go back to poverty, we have 36.4. And if we want to look at near poverty, then obviously it's much higher. It's 54.2%. Now, here's another really interesting thing. Let's say that I want to say, okay, I want to compare myself to, let's say, somebody who was non-white but with these characteristics. You can just click that, hit submit another, and there you see what their characteristics or what their likelihood of experiencing poverty would be in the next, and here we have the next 5 years, given these other characteristics. So you can really make these interesting comparisons. I could say, well, let me change this to somebody who's married, who's white, who has beyond high school education, and still 25 to 29, what would be their risk? Well, it's much, much smaller. So what this allows you to do is really on the fly look at how these characteristics affect the risk of poverty. And of course, this isn't saying, well, this is definitely going to happen, but what it's saying is that based on hundreds of thousands of cases, somebody with these characteristics have this likelihood of experiencing poverty. And I think that's quite powerful. And what it's doing is it's putting this research in the hands of individuals so they can use this both to look at their own characteristics and to look at other characteristics as well. Now, there's also some other really cool things. I won't go into this. I developed this musical chairs simulation. Basically, what this does is it looks at the idea of how many people are able to find a decent paying job given certain characteristics. And I won't go into it, but it's a pretty cool kind of simulation. And again, it's based on all, hundreds of thousands of cases of information. But I'll just mention a couple other things here. One is this discussion guide. So a lot of times people might come and look at the poverty risk calculator, but they want to learn more about poverty and inequality. And so what I've done is divide this into 12 modules that gives you some background. So for example, what is poverty? How do we measure it? What do we mean by that? Well, there's some information here about that. But then what's cool is we link to different sources. So here's the Census Bureau. You can go directly to that and find out information about that. If we go back, there's some interviews and different things like that. Going back to the discussion guide, how can we understand the root causes of poverty? Well, again, there's some interview information and there's other information. This center, the Stanford Center, is really interesting. We can click on that. That'll give you a lot of information about poverty and so on and so forth. So there's some really cool things that are linked here. Also, there's a facts and myths section here. And this sort of addresses some of those myths that I was mentioning at the beginning of the podcast here. The idea that most Americans will experience poverty. It really goes against the idea of the myth that many people do not experience poverty. And so there's some data here that you can look at. And again, there's many things that are linked here in terms of addressing that. There's a research section. And then there's a section that tells you a little bit more about this project. So I'll go back to this. And yeah, and that's, and so there's plenty of things to explore here. And it's been, we've had a lot of visitors, as it says here at the bottom. We've had visitors basically from every country in the world, which is really interesting because this is really focused on data in the United States, but had people from all over visited. And it's being used in many universities and high schools and groups around the country, groups that are interested in, like the Rotary Club, that are interested in social issues and trying to think about how can we make a positive impact here. And so this is, I think, a really valuable tool that's out there. And that's accessible. It's free. There's no, you see, there's no advertising. This is all on my dime. I'm not getting any kind of things for this. So I just think it's a valuable thing to have out there. So there we go. And I think we're probably ready for some questions and discussion.
We absolutely are. And first of all, Mark, thank you. That's a fantastic overview of the work that you've been doing and how the site works as well. And so I'm excited for us to get into it. I'll first introduce the team that we've got. So in addition to Mark, I have a guest from Hungary, Victoria. Good to have you. Also from our club and in Vancouver, Canada, is Nick. My name is Rushton. I am in the San Francisco Bay Area. And let's start with a question from Victoria. She asks why the risk calculator there aren't professional experience and skills factored in. Surely these elements are important, but can you talk a little bit about that with regard to how the calculator works?
Yeah, the reason is, and people often ask me, well, why didn't you include this or why didn't you include that? The problem is, as you start including more factors, you get smaller and smaller sample sizes because you're dividing that sample up. And so at some point you have to say, I have to balance sort of what I think is important versus being concerned about the overall size of the samples. And so that's why. Now, we know from research that things like race, gender, marital status, education, and age are really critical factors in terms of the risk of poverty. And so depending on those, the sort of combination of those factors, that risk of poverty can go from about 91% to about 1.5%. So we're getting a lot of variance on those 5 factors. But I completely agree with you. I mean, people will, and although they might say, why don't you divide education up into several different ways? And that's a perfectly reasonable thing. But again, it's because you can only divide the data up and still have confidence with the number of characteristics. So that's why. But that's clearly something that would be important to look at.
As a follow-up question to that, you mentioned at one point hundreds of thousands of cases. Is it that the sample size for the research and the study that you discussed is there a number that we can kind of stick to that?
Yeah, so what it is, so basically what we're talking about is each year there's depending between 5 and 10,000 households, and we're looking over a period of, let's say, 30 or 40 years. So we're talking about maybe there's 300,000, 400,000 cases along those years. So it's something along those lines in terms of the overall population, overall sample size.
Good deal. Nick, you've got a question. Go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I guess I'm loving the dispelling of the myths because I think that especially the length of poverty that struck me as really powerful because I feel like everybody is technically at risk, and I think your calculator shows that. Um, how do you leverage this in the next conversation? This is powerful. I like the musical chairs game. I played it while you pointed it out, and it's visually stunning to see how
Yeah.
we treat this. And I think about the education of my children and how I can guide them to understand these pieces. How are you seeing this with Rotary clubs and others? How do you want us to use this, really, I guess?
Yeah, great question. Well, I mean, I think the idea is, like I am a researcher, I am an academic, and my motivation is looking at the facts, trying to find, this thing we call the truth. And this is an area, poverty and social welfare, where there's as I started in the beginning, so many myths, so many stereotypes. And I think if we're going to have good policy, it needs to be based on facts and data, as opposed to kind of what's going on in the world in the United States today, which is sort of like, well, you know, you have your facts, I have my facts. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case. So what I would like is for, you know, groups like Rotary Club and other groups to be, first of all, to be able to use this to educate themselves about what is going on here in terms of poverty and in terms of inequality. I think that that's a really important starting point. And then the idea is to go from there. And I guess, you know, my theme in my work over a long period of time is, again, this idea that poverty is an issue that affects us all. And I'll give you an example of this in some other work that I've done that I haven't mentioned, but that is on the website. One of the arguments that I think a really strong argument that we can make is that reducing poverty is really in all of our self-interest. And I would argue it's all in our economic self-interest. And here's why. I did a study with a graduate student here where we looked at, and we tried to be very conservative in this. We looked at what was the economic cost of childhood poverty in the United States. Now, we know that childhood poverty results in higher healthcare costs. We know it results in less economic productivity when children become adults if they've been in poverty. We also know that there's criminal justice costs that are raised. So we tried to factor in a few things. And what we estimated was that on an annual basis, again, just looking at a few things, the cost of childhood poverty in the United States was slightly over $1 trillion. And to put that in perspective, in the year that we looked at this, that was about 28% of the entire federal budget. So the question here is, it's not a question of paying or not paying. It's a question of how we want to pay. And in the United States, we're often paying on the back end of the problem, which is always more expensive than paying on the front end of the problem, which is the prevention side. And so, you know, what I've tried to do is make these sort of strong arguments for why this is really in all of our self-interest. And I think other countries, you're in Canada, I think Canada does certainly a better job than the United States does in terms of addressing poverty and child poverty. Other OECD countries, I think, do a better job and I think are more attuned to this idea that this is in all of our own self-interest to address this problem. So that's a long way of sort of answering your question, but I think it's a really important component of all of this work.
Excellent. In thinking about these particular issues, right, I assume you have also studied a range of the kinds of programs that are designed to address poverty in some way. And if there are one or two or three particularly innovative programs that you've seen you'd like to speak to, you know, maybe it's a particular approach to UBI and a set universal basic income in a given geography or whatever it might be. I'd welcome your thoughts on those.
Right. Well, you know, so a lot of countries, like European countries, have what's known as basically a child allowance kind of system. So if you have children, the government is going to provide you with some assistance on a monthly level to help raise those children. It's kind of like a UBI in a way, but it's directed towards families that have young children. And we did that for a short period of time during the pandemic. We took the tax credit and we made it on a monthly basis. And actually, the estimates were, these came out of Columbia University, was that cut child poverty by something like 45%. It was pretty dramatic. And then what happened was it was in place for about 6 months and then it went away and poverty rates went up. So that's just one policy that I think is really can be very, very effective. People have talked about a universal basic income. I kind of like a little bit better the idea of a guaranteed minimum income, which would say nobody should fall below a certain floor. The problem with a universal basic income is the positive is that it's popular because it's like Social Security. It applies to everyone. The problem is it's not as effective because you're giving money to people that, you know, maybe earning $300,000, $400,000. But if you have a guaranteed minimum income, then it's more targeted to folks that really need that. But we can debate about all those kinds of. The other thing that I would say is really critical, and it's very hard. This is a very hard thing to address. Is We need one of the keys to addressing poverty is having enough livable wage, decent paying jobs for everybody that needs it. Because we've done in the United States, we've done a pretty good job in over the last 30 years or so in creating jobs. The problem has been more and more of those jobs are low paying, without benefits, and people are struggling to survive on those kind of jobs. So we need to think about what can we do to address that.
So the the thing that stands out for me is, and this is captured, I think, really well in your facts and myths section, is that you look at something like guaranteed minimum income, and you can imagine someone saying, where are we going to get the money for that? But I mean, it just seems like you're giving this very strong message of, hey, look, that money is getting spent. It's just a matter of how,
Right.
right? And
That's right.
whether that's in, like programs related to far more expensive healthcare through, the ER, or, through its, less productivity over time, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Um, is there a novel argument for doing this kind of thing or not doing this kind of thing that has surprised even you?
Well, um, yeah, I mean, again, I think you hit it on the head, which is it's not a question of us saving money or not spending money or spending money. We are spending the money. I think the problem is we don't recognize it, and I think part of the problem, which is something else, is our political cycle is so focused on the next 2 years, the next 4 years. I'm talking about the next 15, 20 years when these kids who are in poverty are going to become young adults. And but we don't think in those terms. So another way, I just was going back to your question about sort of thinking about policies. A policy that we do have that does try to pull up folks who are working on the bottom end is the earned income tax credit, and that turns out to be that's actually the largest cash poverty alleviation program that we have in the United States. And so what that means is that if you're working and you're below a certain income level over the year, the government will provide you with a tax credit, and you get a rebate to get your income up to a more reasonable level. It's not that much, but it does help a lot of families. So that's a way of thinking about addressing the problem in terms of the tax structure rather than thinking about minimum wage, which is putting more of the onus on the employer. And I think both of those are ways that we can think about helping people who are working but are struggling and can't get out of poverty.
I'll finish the Q&A with a question about given the research you've done, I'm interested in your perspective on charity. So how do you think about charitable organizations, charitable efforts, charity as an idea?
I think it's a vital component. I mean, look, I'm in a school of social work. We deal with all kinds of organizations and things like that, and I think charity is really, really important. And I think most of these groups, charitable groups, would say, but that's not enough. That you have to have a government response, particularly on a federal level, but also to some extent on a state and local level as well. So I would view it as part of a group of entities that are important in terms of addressing poverty. And too often, again, in the United States, we really shy away from having a pretty strong, active federal response in terms of issues like poverty. And again, what I'm trying to do is to say, we really need to rethink that and really have a re-energize that sort of thing. But certainly, yes, charitable organizations are absolutely vital, and particularly, I think, at the local level, where you're actually interacting with folks who are, down and out or need assistance.
Wonderful. Well, Mark, thank you so much. I'm going to wind things down, then I'll hand it back to you at the very end. But for all of you who have joined us in by watching this video, by listening to the podcast, just a reminder that you can find all sorts of wonderfully interesting messages about how to improve the world through our site, which is SiliconValleyRotary.com, more easily found by going to Rotary.org. Cool. Our library, our YouTube library is an extensive one with hundreds and hundreds of these recordings. You will find via our club that the different podcasts we offer can enrich the commute time or the time on your treadmill or whatever it may be. We hope that these are the kinds of things that will inspire you to see the joy and meaning that can be part of being within a group that seeks solutions and seeks to do good and to take care of those in need. As we always like to do, we hand it back to our speaker for the final word. So, Mark, what would you like people to have clearly in mind as they finish up this video or this podcast?
Well, first of all, thanks, Rush. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast. And again, I just the work that the Rotary Club does, in many ways, is just so fantastic. And I guess I would say, as you were talking, I was thinking of this quote, and I use it in my and actually in a couple of my books. It's a quote from Margaret Mead, and she says, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And so it's people coming together like yourself, people that are in the Rotary Club that can really make a difference. Sometimes, we think these problems are so large, and they are, and they're difficult. But it begins with us. It begins with you and me. It begins with a discussion. It begins with talking about these issues and then moving from that into other areas, whether it's political or community or whatever it may be. So again, I'm really appreciating getting the chance to talk about it. And I would encourage everybody to, if you're interested, take a look at the Confronting Poverty website. It's available. You can use it as much as you want and hopefully learn a little bit more about these issues of poverty and inequality.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week.